May 6, 1942. Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland. Lieutenant Edward Uhl stood in the morning cold, holding a steel tube he'd pulled from a scrap pile just hours before, with coat hanger wire bent into makeshift sights. Around him, generals and colonels waited to watch demonstrations of complex British anti-tank weapons, massive contraptions, requiring trained crews and intricate mechanics. None of them knew that the simple tube in Uhl's hands would rewrite the mathematics of armoured warfare, transform American infantry from hunted to hunters, and save tens of thousands of Allied lives in the process. Within 18 months, this $25 weapon would force Germany to completely reorganize its armoured tactics, inspire desperate attempts to copy American innovation, and prove that sometimes the most revolutionary solutions come not from engineering perfection, but from a forgotten engineer willing to see potential in what others considered scrap metal. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The story of the bazooka doesn't begin with military planning or defense contracts. It begins with frustration, desperation, and the kind of creative thinking that emerges when conventional solutions fail. By early 1942, American military planners faced a terrifying problem. German panzer divisions had demonstrated devastating effectiveness in Poland, France, and Russia. American infantry possessed virtually no portable weapons capable of stopping modern tanks. The standard anti-tank rifle, weighing 38 pounds, could barely scratch medium armor. Anti-tank grenades required suicidal approaches to within throwing distance. Molotov cocktails were acts of desperation, not viable tactics. American soldiers were being trained to face the most powerful armored forces in history, with weapons that belonged to an earlier era. The human cost of this deficiency wasn't theoretical. Intelligence reports from Soviet forces detailed how German tank columns would simply roll through infantry positions, machine-gunning soldiers who had no means of fighting back. British forces in North Africa reported similar experiences, watching helplessly as panzer divisions maneuvered freely because infantry possessed no effective counter. The psychological impact devastated morale. Soldiers, trained to be brave, to stand their ground, found themselves fleeing from armor not because they lacked courage, but because they lacked tools. Military psychologists documented a phenomenon they called tank panic, the complete breakdown of unit cohesion when armor appeared, and infantry knew they were helpless. Traditional anti-tank weapons existed, but each came with crippling limitations. The British boy's anti-tank rifle weighed 36 pounds, had vicious recoil that bruised even large men, and could barely penetrate the frontal armor of German medium tanks. The gun required a soldier strong enough to carry it, skilled enough to aim it precisely under fire, and lucky enough to hit a small, vulnerable spot on a moving target. The American 37mm anti-tank gun was more effective, but weighed nearly 1,000 pounds, required a trained crew of 6, and couldn't go where infantry went. It had to be towed, positioned, and was often abandoned when infantry needed to advance or retreat quickly. These weapons didn't give infantry anti-tank capability. They created specialized units that couldn't keep pace with rapidly changing battlefield conditions. The problem consumed military planners throughout 1941 and early 1942. How do you give an average infantry soldier the power to destroy a tank? The weapon would need to be light enough for 1 or 2 men to carry across any terrain, simple enough for a soldier with minimal training to operate under extreme stress, powerful enough to penetrate several inches of armor plating, cheap enough to mass-produce by the thousands, reliable enough to function in desert heat, winter cold, jungle humidity. Every proposed solution failed one or more of these requirements. Complex weapons couldn't be mass-produced quickly. Powerful weapons were too heavy. Simple weapons lacked penetrating power. The military establishment began to accept that perhaps no single weapon could meet all these needs, that infantry would simply have to rely on supporting tanks and artillery to deal with enemy armor. This is where Edward Uhl enters the story not as a celebrated weapons designer, but as a frustrated engineer who refused to accept the impossible. Born in 1918, Uhl had grown up during the Great Depression, learning to fix anything with whatever materials were available. That background of making do, of seeing potential in discarded objects, would prove more valuable than advanced degrees or prestigious positions. By 1942, Uhl was working with Colonel Leslie Skinner on rocket development at Aberdeen Proving Ground. They weren't working on anti-tank weapons specifically. They were exploring whether small rockets might have any military application at all. The work was considered secondary, unimportant, the kind of project given to junior officers and young engineers, while the serious people worked on serious weapons. Skinner and Uhl had been developing small rockets with shaped charge warheads, exploring the theoretical possibility that a hollow charge could focus explosive force to penetrate armor. The physics were understood. A cone-shaped cavity in an explosive charge would, upon detonation, create a jet of superheated gas and metal capable of burning through steel. The problem was delivery. Shaped charges had to detonate at the optimal distance from armor to work effectively. Too close, and the jet didn't form properly. Too far, and it dispersed. Hand-thrown grenades couldn't reliably achieve the right standoff distance. Artillery shells worked, but required calling for fire support. What infantry needed was a way to deliver a shaped charge to exact range on demand. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Uhl's breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. He realized that a rocket didn't need to be accurate if the launcher could be aimed. Traditional thinking approached rockets as artillery fired from fixed positions at distant targets, requiring complex calculations and sophisticated guidance. But what if you simply put a rocket in a tube, aimed the tube like a rifle, and let the soldier's eye provide the guidance? The rocket didn't need to fly far, just far enough to reach a tank before infantry got killed. It didn't need pinpoint accuracy because tanks were large targets. It just needed to be simple enough, and that any soldier could point and shoot. The concept seemed almost too simple to work, which is precisely why military establishment hadn't considered it seriously. Weapons were supposed to be sophisticated, engineered, precise. Uhl's idea was crude, improvised, more like a toy than a serious weapon. But Uhl had grown up fixing farm equipment with scrap metal, building radios from spare parts, making broken things work. He understood that elegance wasn't the same as effectiveness. A simple solution that worked was infinitely better than a complex solution that never left the drawing board. When Major General Gladion Barnes scheduled demonstrations of British spigot mortars at Aberdeen on May 6, 1942, Uhl saw an opportunity. The spigot mortars were exactly the kind of weapons the establishment favoured, complex mechanisms with multiple moving parts, requiring specialised training and strong crews to operate. They looked impressive, represented significant engineering effort, and cost thousands of dollars each. Uhl knew they would fail. He'd studied the specifications and understood that any weapon too complicated for use under combat stress was ultimately useless. But he also knew that simply criticizing wouldn't change minds. He needed to demonstrate an alternative. The night before the demonstration, Uhl literally assembled his launcher from materials found around Aberdeen. This wasn't careful preparation or meticulous planning. This was desperation engineering. He found a steel tube in a scrap pile that happened to be the right diameter for his rockets. The tube wasn't manufactured for this purpose. It was probably waste from some other project, something someone else had thrown away. He cut it to length with a hacksaw. For sights, he bent a wire coat hanger with pliers, creating a simple ring through which the operator could look. There was no sophisticated aiming mechanism, no complex fire control, just bent wire attached to a metal tube. For electrical ignition, he connected dry cell batteries, the same type used in flashlights, to a simple trigger mechanism. The entire assembly looked like something a high school student might build in shop class. Uhl's colleagues were skeptical. This wasn't how serious weapons looked. There was no complex engineering, no precision machining, no sophisticated components. The launcher looked crude because it was crude. But Uhl understood something that more educated engineers sometimes forgot: functionality mattered more than appearance. An ugly weapon that worked was infinitely preferable to a beautiful weapon that didn't. His launcher would either prove the concept or fail spectacularly. Either way, he'd have an answer. The morning of May 6th arrived cold and overcast. Generals and colonels gathered to watch the scheduled demonstration of British anti-tank weapons. 5 different Spigot mortars were set up, impressive-looking devices with complex sighting systems and substantial weight. A target tank, an M3 Stuart, was positioned 150 yards downrange and set in motion. The demonstration was meant to show American officers what modern anti-tank weapons looked like, to establish parameters for future American development. The British weapons represented the cutting edge of anti-tank technology, or so everyone believed. The first Spigot mortar fired. The crew struggled with the complex aiming mechanism, trying to track the moving tank while managing the heavy weapon. The round missed widely. The second weapon fired with similar results. Then the third, fourth, and fifth. None of the sophisticated British weapons managed to hit a tank-sized target at 150 yards. The crews blamed the weapon's weight, the difficulty of traversing quickly, the complexity of the sighting systems. Generals exchanged concerned glances. If these were the best anti-tank weapons available, American infantry faced a grim future. Then, Uhl stepped forward, with his scrap metal tube and coat-hanger sights. The contrast was almost comical. Sophisticated British engineering versus improvised American junk. Most of the assembled officers paid little attention, assuming this was some kind of preliminary test or training demonstration. Uhl shouldered the tube, lined up the bent wire sights on the moving tank, and squeezed the trigger. The rocket whooshed out with a distinctive sound, a sound that would soon become intimately familiar to millions of soldiers. It flew straight and true, slamming into the tank's side with a sharp explosion. Uhl calmly reloaded, a process that took approximately 5 seconds, and fired again. Another direct hit. The assembled generals stood in stunned silence. Major General Barnes walked over to examine the weapon, turning it over in his hands, looking for some hidden complexity that would explain its effectiveness. He found none. It was literally a steel tube with bent wire sights and battery ignition. Barnes, according to accounts preserved in Army Ordnance records, held up the tube and said it looked like Bob Burns's bazooka, referring to a musical instrument used by a popular radio comedian. The name stuck immediately. Within minutes, Barnes was demanding 5,000 units for immediate production. What Uhl had demonstrated went beyond simple mechanical success. He'd proven that the right approach to a problem mattered more than sophisticated engineering. While British designers had created complex weapons that required specialized crews, Uhl had created something any soldier could use. While others had focused on precision and sophistication, he'd focused on simplicity and reliability. His weapon succeeded not despite its crudeness, but because of it. There were fewer components to break, fewer steps to master, fewer ways for things to go wrong under combat stress. The speed of what happened next remains remarkable even by wartime standards. Barnes's order for 5,000 units went out that same afternoon. General Electric's factories received specifications within days. By October 1942, American industry was producing 5,000 bazookas monthly. The timeline from improvised prototype to mass production spanned just 5 months, a pace that would be considered impossible under normal procurement procedures. But these weren't normal times, and the bazooka wasn't a normal weapon. Its very simplicity enabled rapid production. Any factory with basic welding equipment could manufacture the tubes. The electrical components were standard items already in production. The rockets used existing explosive compounds in a new configuration. The transformation from prototype to production weapon revealed something profound about American industrial capability. While Germany focused on engineering perfection, creating weapons that required specialized facilities and skilled craftsmen, America embraced the philosophy of good enough, fast enough, and cheap enough to overwhelm. The bazooka embodied this approach perfectly. Each launcher required just 20 pounds of steel, basic welding that any competent worker could perform, and simple electrical components costing $25 total. The M6 rockets cost $8 each to produce. Compare this to a Sherman tank at $75,000 or a 37mm anti-tank gun requiring thousands in manufacturing costs and specialized tooling. The bazooka represented democracy, made manifest in steel, a weapon so simple that free workers in factories across America could produce them by the thousands, while simultaneously building ships, aircraft, and everything else needed to win a global war. But production meant nothing without soldiers who could use the weapon effectively. This is where the bazooka's second revolution occurred in training. Captain Franklin Johnson, serving as training officer at Fort Benning, documented the dramatic difference between traditional anti-tank weapons and the new rocket launcher. A soldier needed weeks to master the 37mm anti-tank gun, learning complex calculations for range, windage, and moving targets. The boy's anti-tank rifle required significant upper body strength just to fire without injury, and marksman-level skill to hit small, vulnerable spots on tanks. By contrast, Johnson's training reports noted that any soldier could learn basic bazooka operation in a single afternoon. The weapon required no complex mathematics, no exceptional strength, no years of marksmanship training. Point the tube, line up the simple sights, squeeze the trigger. A farm boy from Iowa and a factory worker from Detroit could both become effective tank hunters with minimal instruction. This democratization of anti-tank capability represented a philosophical shift in military thinking. Traditional weapons created specialized roles, anti-tank gunners, heavy weapons crews, positions requiring specific soldiers with particular physical attributes and extensive training. The bazooka made every infantryman a potential tank destroyer. This wasn't just a tactical change, but a strategic one. German doctrine relied on tanks creating breakthrough points, where concentrated armor could overwhelm defenses and exploit into rear areas. This worked when only specialized anti-tank units could fight back, when destroying those units meant tanks could operate freely. But what happened when every infantry squad possessed anti-tank capability? When every building, every hedgerow, every pile of rubble might hide soldiers with weapons capable of destroying tanks? The mathematics of breakthrough operations changed fundamentally. The weapon's first combat test came under circumstances that nearly doomed it before proving its worth. Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa on November 8, 1942, included 5,000 bazookas distributed among American units. General Dwight Eisenhower, coordinating the massive amphibious operation, discovered the night before the invasion that troops had received no training whatsoever on the new weapon. The bazookas had arrived in sealed crates marked secret with explicit orders not to open them until combat operations began. No instruction manuals were included. No training cadre had been deployed. The military bureaucracy, in its rush to get new weapons to frontline units, had somehow forgotten that soldiers needed to know how to use those weapons. Eisenhower was reportedly furious, but there was nothing to be done. The invasion was launching in hours. Soldiers would have to figure out the bazookas under fire. The results were predictably chaotic. The 509th Parachute Infantry Regiment reported that of their first 20 rockets fired in combat, only 7 functioned properly. The sea voyage had damaged many M6 rockets, moisture seeping into electrical connections and explosive charges. Soldiers, unfamiliar with the weapon, made basic mistakes holding it incorrectly, aiming improperly, failing to maintain proper electrical contact. Some troops, seeing the tube's simplicity, assumed it was safer than it actually was, standing too close to the backblast area and suffering burns. Others, expecting complex operation, overthought simple procedures and fumbled under stress. The first week of North African combat saw numerous bazooka failures, leading some officers to question whether the weapon was viable at all. But then something remarkable happened. Soldiers began teaching themselves. The bazooka's essential simplicity meant that even without formal instruction, troops could figure out proper operation through trial and error. Veterans from early engagements explained what worked to replacements. Units developed their own training programs in rear areas between combat operations. Non-commissioned officers created informal schools, using captured enemy vehicles as targets. Within weeks, American infantry went from complete unfamiliarity to developing sophisticated bazooka tactics. This organic learning process, where soldiers taught themselves and each other, demonstrated the weapon's fundamental accessibility in ways that formal training never could have. The 1st Armoured Division's combat log for November 10, 1942, contains an entry that marks a turning point. Anti-tank team destroyed 2 Vichy French Renault tanks with new rocket weapon near Port Liauti, weapon effective when functioning properly. Those last 5 words mattered. When functioning properly. The issue wasn't the weapon's design, but implementation, damaged ammunition, lack of training, initial unfamiliarity. Once those problems were addressed, the bazooka began demonstrating its potential. Throughout late 1942 and early 1943, after-action reports from North Africa showed steady improvement in bazooka effectiveness as soldiers mastered the weapon and supply chains delivered properly maintained ammunition. The real test came when German forces encountered the bazooka. The Battle of Kasserine Pass, February 14th through 24th, 1943, marked the first major engagement between American and German forces in World War II. Elements of the Afrika Korps 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions, commanded by Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, smashed through inexperienced American units, inflicting heavy casualties and forcing a chaotic retreat. Among the equipment abandoned or captured were 5 intact Monet bazookas and approximately 20 M6 rockets. These were immediately shipped to Berlin for analysis, arriving at the Wehrmacht's weapons testing facility at Kummersdorf on February 28. The German technical assessment, preserved in documents now held in the Bundesarchiv, reveals their recognition of the weapon's revolutionary nature. German engineers, accustomed to sophisticated weapon systems requiring precision manufacturing, initially dismissed the bazooka as crude American improvisation, but testing changed their minds completely. The reports noted with surprise that this simple tube, requiring minimal production facilities and basic materials, could penetrate 80 millimeters of armor at 100 meters. More concerning from the German perspective, the weapon could be operated by any soldier with elementary training and manufactured using industrial capacity that even bombed-out factories could provide. The Germans immediately began developing their own version, scaling up the design with an 88mm warhead for increased penetration. By September 1943, the Raketenpanzerbuchs 43, quickly nicknamed the Panzerschreck, entered production. The fact that Germany felt compelled to copy an American weapon represented a significant psychological shift. German military doctrine had long held that superior engineering and technical sophistication would overcome numerical disadvantages. Germany's tanks were better than Allied tanks, their optics superior, their crews more experienced, but the bazooka negated many of these advantages. A technically superior tank was just as dead when hit by a $25 rocket as an inferior one. Experience meant nothing when an inexperienced American private could destroy a Panther from concealment at 75 yards. The German response, copying and then trying to improve on American design, revealed their recognition that sometimes simple solutions trump sophisticated ones. German production records illustrate the strategic implications. The Panzerschreck, while possessing superior penetrating power with its larger warhead, required 24 pounds of steel and 18 man-hours to produce at a cost of 150 Reichsmarks. The American bazooka used 15 pounds of steel, required 2.4 man-hours to manufacture, and cost $25. By August 1944, America had produced over 400,000 bazookas, while Germany managed 289,151 Panzerschrecks during the entire war. The Americans were outproducing German copies by nearly 2-to-1, while simultaneously manufacturing simpler, lighter weapons. This production differential meant that while some German infantry units received Panzerschrecks, American units had bazookas in abundance. Every American infantry company had 5 bazookas by mid-1944. Every battalion had 25 to 35. The weapons were as common as machine guns, standard equipment rather than specialized tools. The invasion of Sicily, Operation Husky, beginning July 10, 1943, marked the bazooka's maturation as a weapon system. American forces now fielded the improved M1A1 model with better electrical contacts and the more reliable M6A1 rocket. Soldiers had trained extensively with the weapon, developing confidence in its capabilities and understanding its limitations. The mountainous Sicilian terrain provided ideal conditions for bazooka employment, short engagement ranges, abundant concealment, numerous opportunities for ambush. Tank commanders who had operated with relative freedom in North Africa's open desert found Sicily claustrophobic and dangerous. The 82nd Airborne Division reported an engagement near Biscari that demonstrated both the weapon's potential and the skills soldiers had developed. A bazooka team achieved a hit on a Tiger tank, penetrating through the driver's vision slot, one of the few vulnerable points on that heavily armoured vehicle. This wasn't typical performance. The Tiger's thick armour normally deflected bazooka rounds unless hit on side or rear plates. But the engagement showed that skilled, determined soldiers could exploit even the smallest vulnerabilities. The Hermann Göring Panzer Division's War Diary for July 11th noted with concern that enemy infantry equipped with rocket weapons capable of destroying armour at 100 to 150 metres. Tank commanders must exercise increased caution in urban areas. This represented exactly the psychological impact military planners had hoped for German armour forced into caution, unable to exploit breakthroughs, slowed by the threat of infantry anti-tank weapons. Colonel James Gavin, commanding the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, submitted a report stating that the bazooka has given the American infantrymen confidence against enemy armour. In Sicily, we destroyed 17 German tanks with bazookas. The psychological effect exceeds even the physical destruction. That last observation proved prophetic. The actual number of tanks destroyed by bazookas, while significant, mattered less than the operational impact. German tanks began requiring extensive infantry support, moving cautiously, avoiding at situations where they might be ambushed. The speed and shock that had characterized German armored operations in 1940 and 1941 became impossible when every building might hide soldiers with anti-tank rockets. The Italian campaign, beginning September 1943, revealed the bazooka's versatility beyond pure anti-tank employment. The mountainous terrain and medieval towns created tactical situations where traditional anti-tank guns were useless, too heavy to move through rubble, unable to cover multiple approach routes, requiring fixed positions that enemy could identify and avoid. Bazookas, by contrast, went everywhere infantry went. Teams could position themselves on upper floors, covering streets below. They could move through buildings, relocating before enemy could respond. They could split up, covering multiple routes simultaneously. And soldiers quickly discovered that shaped charge warheads designed to penetrate tank armour worked equally well against fortified buildings, bunkers, and defensive positions. The December 1943 battle for Ortona demonstrated innovative bazooka tactics. Canadian forces, working alongside American units, developed mouse-holing techniques using bazookas to blast passages through walls rather than moving through dangerous streets. The 1st Canadian Infantry Division's War Diary recorded that American rocket launchers proved invaluable in street fighting, used against fortified houses with good effect. This adaptation of an anti-tank weapon to urban warfare showed the bazooka's fundamental utility. A device for delivering shaped charges to precise locations had applications far beyond tank destruction. Any target requiring explosive force, bunkers, pillboxes, fortified buildings, even cave entrances in the Pacific became vulnerable to bazooka fire. By January 1944, American production reached 20,000 bazookas monthly. The M9 model had been introduced, featuring a breakdown design allowing the tube to separate into two pieces for easier carrying by airborne troops. This version used magneto-ignition, eliminating batteries that could fail in extreme cold or heat. The M6A3 rocket with its blunt nose prevented deflection on angled armour, a problem with earlier pointed nose designs. Fifth Army reports from Italy documented that every infantry battalion now possessed 24 to 36 bazookas as standard equipment. The weapon had transitioned from experimental to essential, from specialized to standard. This proliferation meant that German forces faced bazooka-equipped infantry everywhere, not just in specific sectors or during particular operations, but constantly, across entire fronts. The proliferation of bazookas fundamentally altered German armoured doctrine in ways that rippled through every level of their military organisation. Wehrmacht Training Directive 43/18, issued December 1943, represented a complete reversal of the principles that had brought Germany victory after victory in the war's early years. The directive mandated that tanks would not operate in urban areas without infantry support, that all buildings must be cleared before armour advances, and that a minimum 100-metre distance must be maintained from uncleared structures. Shirts and side skirts became mandatory on all vehicles to provide standoff distance that would disrupt shaped charge jets before they reached main armour. These weren't minor tactical adjustments, they represented the abandonment of the blitzkrieg concept that had revolutionized warfare. Speed and shock, the principles that had carried German forces across Poland in weeks and France in 6 weeks, became impossible when every hedge, building and pile of rubble might hide soldiers with rockets. German tank crews began improvising additional protection, welding extra track links to their vehicles' sides, filling sandbags and attaching them to vulnerable areas, even mixing and applying concrete to create crude but effective standoff armour. The Zimmerit anti-magnetic paste applied to German tanks from December 1943 to October 1944 was partially a response to shaped charge threats, though it proved largely ineffective against rocket warheads. A captured document from the 2nd SS Panzer Division dated March 1944 stated bluntly, "American rocket launchers present in every infantry unit, speed and shock tactics no longer viable, methodical advance with infantry screening required." For an army that had built its doctrine on rapid manoeuvre and exploitation, this represented doctrinal defeat even before considering physical losses. The psychological edge that German armour had enjoyed, the terror that panzer divisions inspired in enemy infantry, had been neutralised by a steel tube and a shaped charge. By D-Day, June 6, 1944, the bazooka had become so integral to American infantry organisation that planning documents simply assumed its presence. Among the 156,000 Allied troops landing in Normandy were thousands of bazooka teams equipped with the latest M9A1 model featuring optical sights for improved accuracy. The bocage country of Normandy, dense hedgerows creating natural defensive positions, proved ideal for bazooka employment. First Army records show that bazookas accounted for 12% of German armoured vehicle losses in the American sector during the 6 weeks following D-Day. But again, the statistical impact understates the operational effect. German commanders, knowing that every hedgerow might conceal anti-tank teams, advanced with painful caution. Tank units that should have been counter-attacking to drive Allied forces back into the sea instead moved slowly, methodically, losing the initiative that might have made those counter-attacks effective. The 29th Infantry Division's after-action report for June and July 1944 noted that bazooka teams operating in bocage country achieved high success rates against enemy armour. German tanks increasingly reluctant to advance without extensive infantry reconnaissance. This reluctance created opportunities for Allied artillery, aircraft, and supporting tanks to engage German armour under favourable conditions. The bazooka didn't need to destroy every German tank personally. It needed to slow them down, make them predictable, force them into patterns that other weapons could exploit. In this role, the weapon proved devastatingly effective. German armoured reserves that might have changed Normandy's outcome arrived piecemeal, cautiously, too slowly to prevent Allied breakout. The human dimension of bazooka effectiveness often gets lost in discussions of armour penetration and production statistics. Behind every successful engagement stood soldiers who had overcome natural fear to close with enemy armour. Approaching a tank armed only with a bazooka required extraordinary courage. The effective range was 75 yards, close enough to see tank commanders in their cupolas, close enough to hear the engine and the squeal of tracks. Many soldiers who carried bazookas were teenagers, 19 or 20 years old, facing machines that had dominated battlefields from Poland to the outskirts of Moscow. The weapon gave them tools, but they provided the courage. After-action interviews reveal common themes: the dry mouth before an engagement, the tunnel vision while aiming, the desperate prayer that the rocket would fly true, the explosive relief when armor burned or the crew bailed out. Technical Sergeant Donald Bracken of the 394th Infantry Regiment described destroying a Panther tank near Rocherath on December 17, 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge. The rocket hit the rear engine deck. The tank caught fire, and the crew abandoned it. Range was about 75 yards. His matter-of-fact tone in the combat interview masks the reality of that engagement, waiting in winter cold, as a 45-ton tank approached, knowing that if the rocket missed or malfunctioned, the Panther's machine guns would cut him down before he could reload. Multiply that courage by thousands of similar engagements across Europe, and you begin to understand the human foundation beneath the weapon's technical success. The bazooka worked because American soldiers made it work, closing to effective range under fire, holding steady while aiming, trusting in a weapon that was, after all, just a steel tube and a rocket. The extreme cold of the Ardennes offensive in December 1944 created documented problems that soldiers had to overcome through improvisation. Battery failures in remaining M1A1 models still in service required crews to warm batteries inside their jackets before use. Rocket. Propellant burned differently in sub-zero temperatures, affecting range and accuracy in ways that soldiers had to compensate for through experience rather than training. Despite these challenges, 18th Airborne Corps records show bazookas destroyed or disabled 89 German armoured vehicles during the Battle of the Bulge. Every one of those kills represented soldiers functioning effectively under the worst possible conditions: exhausted, cold, facing an enemy offensive that had achieved complete surprise and was threatening to split Allied armies. One of the war's most remarkable bazooka employments came from Major Charles Carpenter of the 4th Armoured Division, who mounted 6 M9 bazookas on his L4 Grasshopper observation aircraft. The innovation sounds absurd, a slow, unarmed spotter plane carrying anti-tank rockets. But Carpenter understood that German tanks were vulnerable from above, their top armour much thinner than frontal or side plates. His combat record, verified by 4th Armoured Division records, and his Silver Star citation, documents 2 Panther tanks destroyed near Aracourt on September 20, 1944, 1 Panzer IV destroyed in October, and 3 additional armoured vehicles destroyed in November. Carpenter's aircraft, complete with mounting brackets for the bazookas, was discovered in an Austrian museum in 2017 and has been restored. His innovation demonstrated the bazooka principle's adaptability, a weapon system so simple and reliable that it could be adapted to platforms never envisioned by its designers. The economics of bazooka warfare reveal why America's industrial approach proved superior to German technical sophistication. To destroy 1 German tank using American tanks typically cost 2.5 Shermans lost per German tank destroyed, approximately $187,500 in tank losses. Using anti-tank guns meant gun and crew training, costs of approximately $45,000. Using aircraft, including aircraft losses and munitions, ran approximately $85,000. Using bazookas averaging 5 rockets and occasional launcher loss cost approximately $50. This 1,000-to-1 cost advantage made the bazooka economically revolutionary. For the price of 1 Sherman tank, the Army could purchase 3,000 bazookas and 20,000 rockets, equipping entire divisions with anti-tank capability for the cost of a single tank. This economic reality enabled tactical flexibility that German forces couldn't match. American infantry could afford to expend rockets liberally, taking shots at targets that German troops would have avoided due to ammunition scarcity. Soldiers could train extensively with live ammunition because rockets were cheap enough to use in training rather than hoarding for combat. Units could maintain large stockpiles forward because bazookas and rockets required minimal storage space compared to anti-tank gun ammunition. The weapon's economics created abundance where Germany faced scarcity, enabling aggressive tactics where German doctrine enforced conservation. The Pacific Theatre, though less publicized than European bazooka employment, demonstrated the weapon's versatility against non-armor targets. Marine Corps records from Saipan, June through July 1944, show bazookas destroyed 28 Japanese tanks and countless fortified positions. The weapon's value came primarily from bunker-busting capability. Japanese defensive positions, built into caves and concrete fortifications, often resisted conventional explosives. Shaped charge warheads, designed to concentrate explosive force for armor penetration, worked equally well against reinforced concrete. Marines particularly valued white phosphorus rockets for clearing cave complexes, the chemical weapon creating smoke and flame that drove defenders out or killed them through heat and oxygen depletion. At Iwo Jima, the 5th Marine Division expended 1,847 bazooka rockets in 6 weeks of fighting, the majority fired at fortifications rather than vehicles. The weapon's global distribution through Lend-Lease demonstrated American industrial capacity and willingness to share innovation. The Soviet Union received 8,000 bazookas, the United Kingdom 12,000, Free French Forces 15,000, Chinese Nationalist Forces 3,000, and various other Allied nations received additional thousands. Soviet military archives indicate the Red Army found the bazooka effective but preferred their own anti-tank rifles initially, and later developed the RPG-2 partially based on bazooka principles. British forces used American bazookas extensively in Italy and northwest Europe, appreciating the weapon's reliability compared to their own Piat, which required significant physical strength to cock and had limited effective range. The distribution of hundreds of thousands of bazookas to Allied forces represented a strategic decision-sharing technology that might have been kept secret in hopes that widespread anti-tank capability would accelerate Germany's defeat. The bazooka's influence on post-war military development proved even more significant than its wartime impact. Every modern military equips infantry with portable anti-tank weapons descended directly from the bazooka concept. The M72 Law, the AT-4, the Carl Gustaf recoilless rifle, the Soviet RPG series all embody the principle that Lieutenant Edward Uhl demonstrated with scrap metal and coat hanger wire in May 1942. Individual soldiers should possess the power to defeat armored vehicles. This concept, revolutionary in 1942, became foundational doctrine that persists 80 years later. Modern shoulder-fired anti-tank weapons are more sophisticated, using advanced guidance systems, tandem warheads to defeat reactive armor, and fire-and-forget technology. But they're all answering the same question. Uhl answered, how do you give infantry tank-killing power without requiring sophisticated weapons that can't be mass-produced and distributed widely? The German Tank Museum at Münster includes a permanent display on anti-tank weapons featuring the American bazooka. Their official description states, the American Monet rocket launcher, bazooka, revolutionized anti-tank warfare. Simple, cheap, and effective, it could be operated by any soldier with minimal training. German forces captured examples in Tunisia in 1943 and immediately recognized its potential, developing the Panzerschreck in response. By war's end, the presence of bazookas in every American unit had neutralized German armored superiority. That final sentence, from a German military museum, acknowledges what German commanders recognized during the war: technical superiority in tank design couldn't overcome: the proliferation of simple, effective infantry anti-tank weapons. Final production statistics tell the story of American industrial might. 476,628 bazookas produced during the war. Mon M1A1, M9, M9A1, and M18 models. Over 15 million rockets manufactured, with production peaking at over 8 million in 1944 alone. These weren't precision instruments requiring specialized facilities. They were standardized products manufactured by 237 different subcontractors across 34 states, using distributed production that made the supply chain resilient against bombing or sabotage. Any single factory could be destroyed without significantly impacting overall bazooka availability, unlike German production concentrated in vulnerable facilities. The bazooka succeeded through simplicity rather than sophistication, through quantity rather than technical superiority, through distribution to every unit rather than concentration in specialist formations. It embodied American industrial democracy, free workers in factories across the nation, producing simple weapons in quantities that overwhelmed the enemy. It validated faith in the citizen soldier, trusting ordinary men with extraordinary firepower and the training to use it effectively. Most importantly, it proved that in modern industrial warfare, the ability to mass produce and widely distribute good enough technology could overcome technical superiority. Germany entered World War II with the world's most powerful armoured forces. They were ultimately defeated partly by American teenagers carrying steel tubes that cost less than a bicycle, operated by soldiers who learned to use them in an afternoon, produced in quantities that made them as common as rifles. Edward Uhl's scrap metal tube with coat-hanger sights, demonstrated on a cold morning in May 1942, saved tens of thousands of Allied lives by giving infantry the power to stand against armour. It changed warfare fundamentally, proving that innovation doesn't require complexity, that sometimes the best solution is the simplest one that can be manufactured by the thousands. The bazooka was more than a weapon. It was democracy made manifest in steel and explosives, proof that American ingenuity and mass production could triumph over craftsmanship and technical perfection. From Normandy's hedgerows to Italy's mountains, from the Ardennes forests to Pacific islands, the distinctive whoosh of a bazooka rocket became the sound of infantry fighting back, the sound of tank panic reversed, the sound of American soldiers transformed from hunted to hunters. That simple tube, born from desperation and improvisation, helped write the final chapter of the Third Reich, one rocket at a time. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.